Yeah, it looks like we were ready to go. And I think it's supposed to start at 2:50. We are yeah, I'll just see you and then I'll just stand there. Yeah. You can stay there. I think you can stay wherever you want. I just need you to sit there. Excellent. Wonderful. Welcome. Welcome, everyone. My name is David Rosengart. I am one of the Animal Law LLM students here at Lewis & Clark. And it's my honor to be able to introduce our two panelists for this afternoon's session. First will be Moe Hanjo, who is a double LLM. She holds double LLM degrees from the Lewis & Clark Animal Law and Environmental Law programs. She's a Chopin Koshin Prize winner for a book she is writing about comparative animal shelters between different countries, and is currently pursuing her PhD in comparative law at Hutsusubei University. And our next speaker will be Dr. Garrett Lavis. Dr. Lavis is on the faculty at the Oregon Health Science University in the Behavioral Neuroscience Department, and has done recent research on the communication and social behavior of mice and ground squirrels, which has led to some really interesting results on rodent empathy and altruism. So I know I'm very excited to hear from both of them and to give us the most time for their presentations and for your questions. I will get out of your way. Turn it over to Moe.
First, I would like to thank CALS and LDF for having me here. Today, I'm going to talk about two things. First, world trends in cosmetic animal testing ban, and second, Japanese regulation regarding animal experiment in general. Okay. So the contents. First, I'm going to introduce my talk, then move on to the explanation about EU ban on cosmetic animal testing, followed by movements outside EU. Then going to focus on Japan, like if there are any changes in Japan regarding cosmetic animal testing, and if they're not, what kind of challenges we have in Japan. Then gonna conclude my talk. Okay. So when you say animal testing, rats and mice, like rabbits and other animals are used for many purposes, like household, such as detergents, cosmetics, and today I'm going to focus on cosmetics. The EU Commission, regarding to the EU Commission's definition, cosmetics includes lipsticks, perfumes, toothpastes, and shampoos. For those products, this kind of animal testing has been conducted. So here is stump-tailed macaques. They typically live in wild in subtropical and tropical forest, and they are really social animals. But in laboratory, chemical substances are put on the front of their head for several days. And after those days, part of the skin tissue will be taken off to see how chemicals are affected on their skin tissues. But this kind of testing is banned in over 30 countries around the world, and I'm going to see the reason for that. First, consumers' opinion. So around 60 to 80% of consumers in the world support national ban of animal testing for cosmetics. Also, development of alternatives. So here's one of the examples of alternatives for cosmetics. This is the picture of the system in skin sensitization test called HCAT. HCAT was invented by Shiseido and Kao, one of those Japanese leading cosmetic companies. And according to Shiseido's website, these alternatives cut costs by 1/50th and time by 1/14th. So it's more cost and time efficiency. and also maybe more reliable. So more and more people started to wonder if it is reliable to test on animals to see how safe to use those chemicals on people. And also it's been a global trend. So the EU started the trend. In 2009, EU passed cosmetics regulation, and it was enforced in 2014. This cosmetic regulation applies to 28 member states directly, and it has got 3 successful approaches. First, the EU limited the scope of ban to cosmetics. So if you go to a supermarket or drugstore, for example, you will see many products, and many of those products are tested on animals to see the safety. However, the EU only focused on cosmetics, and some scholars say that cosmetic products are chosen as a scapegoat to escape the strong criticism from animal advocates regarding animal testing in general. And second approach is encouragement of alternatives. So the Commission invested about $270 million for development of alternatives. So the law became an incentive, and it used phase-out steps. So since 2004, the EU banned animal testing for finished cosmetic products, and since 2009, it banned testing on ingredients and combination of ingredients where alternatives are available. And I got this picture from the EU Commission, and in 2013, it shows that it completely banned cosmetic animal testing and the marketing of those products. So, after the EU, many countries followed. For example, Israel, Norway, India, New Zealand, Sao Paulo as a city, and actually some states in the US have got similar ban in California, New York, and New Jersey. And red pin means they passed cosmetic animal testing ban and similar ban, and green pin means they submitted proposal or they banned partially. So in Turkey, they partially banned. Vietnam, China started to phase out cosmetic animal testing ban, cosmetic animal testing. Korea, Taiwan, Brazil as a country, Argentina, the US submitted a proposal of cosmetic animal testing ban, Canada, and Russia this summer. So you see that it's been a really significant world trend, as I listed here. So if you focus on Asia, for example, so China mandated cosmetic animal testing if they want to, if cosmetic companies want to sell products inside China. However, after 2014, they decided to phase out mandatory animal testing for new domestically manufactured ordinary cosmetic products. That means, for example, if Japanese government, if Japanese cosmetic company want to sell products to China, they still have to do animal testing. But they don't have to do animal testing if they make inside China. So Taiwan. So they proposed a bill, and according to the clause 2nd of the Article 23 of the proposal, it uses phasing out steps. So it bans finished ordinary cosmetic products in a year. They ban animal testing for those products in a year, and after 2 years, they ban testing for semi-finished cosmetics, and after 3 years, they completely ban non-ordinary cosmetic products. However, it bans only when there are alternatives available, which is different from the EU. So probably this might not be the incentive of alternative development, and it doesn't mention about marketing ban. So Japanese cosmetic companies still can sell products to Taiwan even they do animal testing. And according to the proposal, the reason for the bill is morality, and also it is not reliable to use animals for safety check, and alternatives are better because it is cheaper and it is safer and quicker. Then we're gonna look at the Japanese situation, because we didn't see that Japanese government had such ban inside like in Japan. So gonna see what's happening there. So Japan doesn't ban, but also it doesn't expressly require animal testing for cosmetics. That means some company started to phase out animal testing for cosmetics. So I got this picture from Shiseido, one of the leading cosmetic company in Japan, and they had a meeting with animal advocates and some vets, some lawyers, to discuss how they can phase out animal testing in their company. And after 2013, they decided to phase out animal testing. So maybe without regulation, they finally phase out animal testing because it is more economically benefit to shift to alternatives, because more and more countries started to phase out animal testing for cosmetics. However, here we see that Japan has a profound problem regarding protection of laboratory animals in general. So Japan has the Act on Welfare and Management of Animals, and it has general principles for humane treatment of animals, which originally passed in 1973. And it has got 50 articles. However, it mainly focuses on companion animals issues, and only one article talk about animal experimentation. So most of the protection excludes laboratory animals and farm animals. So the only one Article 41, talk about experimentation, which states 3 R's, which is replacement, reduction, and refinement. However, it is really vague and not enforced. And we're going to see what is happening there. So, ministry guidelines talk about treatment of laboratory animals, and some companies voluntarily make their own guidelines following the ministry guideline, and some animal testing organizations create animal testing committees. So in this table, the orange line shows the name of some developed countries, and blue line shows the type of regulation regarding animal testing and research. For instance, in UK, you need license to have breeding facilities. Okay, we're gonna look at the Japanese situation. So according to the guideline, it requires directors of the animal testing institution to have to train its researchers, And guidelines also require experimenters to submit a proposal of animal testing to the director, and it provides a form. However, most of the form is yes and no format. So, for instance, if there are no alternative methods, they just have to tick and do not have to explain why and how much they gave effort to find alternatives. Regarding inspection system, some facilities are voluntarily checked by external institutions. However, they have to pay 1.5 million yen, for example, to the evaluation. So, you can imagine that not many institutions will voluntarily get the check. So the guidelines also requires the facility to have committees, and the committee's role is as follows, as shown in here. However, as you can see the bottom line, in Japan, those guidelines just encouraging researchers to have these kind of efforts, but it's not enforced, and so there are no actual data in Japan. So even Japanese government do not know how many animals are used in what kind of testing. And there are no penalty, so lacks incentive to follow guidelines. Okay, then maybe some people wonder why Japan doesn't have any strong legal protection for laboratory animals. And I'm going to show you four possible reasons. First, contradiction between the Act and the protection of experimental animals. Okay, the Act on Welfare and Management of Animals is written in Japanese like this, and this word called aigo means not welfare but loving protection, which is a key for better animal treatment in Japan. And the purpose of the act is to engender spirit for animal welfare among citizens in Japan. And I'm going to show you the difference between protection and loving protection. So when you say protection, it is a prevention of abuse, appropriate treatment and care, which is objective. In other words, it is a rational way of thinking, so it fits with regulation to protect laboratory animals. However, when you say loving protection, it means respect of life through creation of better human-animal relations, which is subjective. In other words, it is an emotional way of thinking. So it is really hard to love animals when you conduct animal testing, like by maybe when you can say abuse or kill animals for research. Second reason is cultural background. So as Japanese researchers have got like a sense of guilt, and there are no regulation to protect animals, so they needed some remedy. And this is one of the traditional way researchers got remedy of the ease sense of guilt. It's called memorial ceremony, and in the ceremony, researchers offer a flower, and then one of the head of the facility talk about gratitude and sometimes apologize for the animals. So it's really, maybe it's kind of special way that Japanese people do to deal with this feeling to sorry like animals. So maybe the Japanese government it was not necessary to have like regulation, because researchers had this kind of like cultural remedy. Yeah. And lack of awareness. So Japan has got limited activism. For instance, one of the biggest animal organization for laboratory animals, they only has 1,200 members, and you can see that it has got big difference between the US and like European countries. So there are less voice for animals, and Japan has got stovepiped government system. So several ministries have got guidelines for proper care of laboratory animals. For instance, Ministry of the Environment, Education, Health, and Agriculture. So it is increasing the complexity of animal experiment regulation. Then what can we do? Do nothing, maybe? Okay. Well, the reality is the survey in 2005 showed that Japan was the second user of animals, and I think this number is changing dramatically because China is probably using more animals now. And some people in Japan started to realize how we use animals for in laboratory. So maybe we have to do something. And young researchers started to realize that we have to care for animals, and then they are more open to animal welfare. For instance, I grew up in a society that companion animals like dogs and cats are family, and maybe it was totally different in like 50 or 60 years ago. So it is also important for researchers to improve animal welfare. Then, second way is to continue dealing under the Animal Welfare Act on Welfare and Management for Animals and self-regulation. However, there are some problems of self-regulation. It lacks uniformity, objectivity, rigorousness, efficiency. So the level of animal welfare varies between institutions. Some government-related universities and institutions are trying so hard, very hard to improve animal welfare because there are guidelines. But it is not. The guidelines doesn't have strong influence to private sectors, such as companies. And the third way is to use other legal or non-legal approaches. Some scholars in Japan stating that we have to have self-regulation with a guarantee system. That means we allow self-regulation system during the process. So we don't talk about like how they have to make sure animal welfare. But to guarantee that if they have got like good outcomes. So it is important to integrate third-party certificate inspection system to central government. So I explained that there are many ministries who's working on the issues. And then those new systems will be provided by expert knowledge, and because researchers in Japan are worrying so much that animal advocates will be involved in this system, in the new system, and they have no choice, and there will be less expert knowledge in the system. So the new system will have to make sure that researchers will understand and accept the system. If we build up this new system, then it overcomes the problem of the stovepipe government. So as a conclusion, more and more countries in the world is accepting cosmetic animal testing ban, and without regulation, even without regulation, Japanese cosmetic companies started to phasing out animal testing for cosmetics. However, Japan now has got profound challenges, and it is time to make some changes as we saw the global trend. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Melanie. Here's what we want there.
Oh, I saw something.
Oh,
Yeah.
think it's thinking.
Yes.
Excellent.
Theoretically. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well, okay, so I'm a neuroscientist, and I've been a vivisectionist, call it that, for 20 years, 25 years. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some experiments that I've done, and I think its implications might be pretty deep. I want you to consider a few things that maybe you haven't considered before. So its title is Empathy and Social Reward in Rodents, with some implications. So Kurt Vonnegut used to talk about stories and that they had very simple shapes. And one of the shapes is something like this. From the beginning to the end, you go from somebody is in good fortune, and they kind of fall into a hole, and then they have to climb themselves out. And I think this talk goes a little bit like that. I'm going to talk about essentially why we do some of these experiments, what we found, where we are now, and maybe a way to get out. So the story goes like this. I'm going to tell you why we need to understand the social challenges of children and adults, and why animal models can be useful. I'm going to talk to you about social interactions as exchanges of emotion. I'm going to talk to you about social reward and empathy in rodents. I'm going to talk to you about neuroscience, its implications for neuroscience in farming, and a little bit about climbing out of the morass that I've created in the process. So autism. There's an epidemic of autism in this world. Currently, 1 out of 66 children has the diagnosis in the United States. Among children, the earliest indications are always social deficits. These social deficits include abnormal eye contact, aloofness, failure to orient to name, failure to use gestures to show, a lack of interactive play, a lack of interest in peers. Some of these things might suggest emotional components. By the time of the diagnosis, which is a little bit later, you typically have a delay in communication, which not only involves what you say, but how you say it, the relationship between gesture and what's said, the intonation of your voice, how you glance at certain items when you're trying to communicate their presence. It also includes a lack of social reciprocity, which is a failure to develop peer relationships or share enjoyment with another person, or to recognize another's distress or perspective, something that we would call empathy. And there's also repetitive behaviors or circumscribed interests, very focused interest in, let's say, dinosaurs or trains. Autism, as I said, has gone up in the population quite dramatically over the years. It's currently here it says 1 in 88. Even more recently, it looks like 1 in 66. So it's a concern, and it's a concern for a lot of people, especially parents of autistic children. So people ask what contributes to the cause. Well, it turns out, for example, in these states of Oregon and Washington, that there's more autism towards the coast, east or west of the Cascades, than there is on the east side, as indicated by the states and the counties in black where the autism prevalence seems to be higher. So you can ask, what contributes? Is it maybe more cloud cover? Maybe we just don't get enough sunlight, we get a lack of vitamin D. Maybe we eat more fish that have a lot of pollutants in it. So to understand how these causes can be dissociated, one way is to use animals. In this case, and I don't like using the word animals because we're animals. So let's say non-human animals. Use non-human animals. So we can ask whether a vitamin D deficiency or some kind of pollutant exposure creates some kind of autistic-like behavior in mice. And we can use a rodent model of cause and effect, essentially. So here's a test. Here's a test. You put a mouse in a cage for 24 hours. It sits alone in that cage. Gets very used to the cage. You add another mouse to the cage. The new mouse explores the cage. Well, the mouse that's in the cage sniffs the mouse that's been added to the cage. And this is kind of what it looks like. What you're going to hear is the background noise in a lab, because it's you're going to listen to ultrasonic noise. But what you're also going to hear are ultrasonic vocalizations between two mice. And that would, of course, be something that you're not hearing because should be all the way up. All right. Let me just tell you, they talk a lot. There's a lot of squeaking going on. There's a lot of information that's we think there's information imparted, probably mostly emotional information in terms of arousal by the mouse that hasn't seen another mouse for 24 hours. We can test these mice, and this is a very typical pattern for a way of assessing autistic-like features in a mouse, an old paradigm. We can isolate them for 24 hours, put them back together, and what we can find is that some mice, more autistic-like mice, might show a lower level of social approach. That's indicated here by the animal indicated with hollow holes versus the filled-in ones. We can show that as they age, there's some sex-specific responses that males tend to get, irrespective of strain, tend to become more approachable towards females, and females tend to become less approachable towards males. We can also see quite profound differences between autistic and typical mice in terms of their vocalizations. These are vocalizations, this is frequency. You can see that the frequency of a call is upward modulated. You go whoop, there's more of those in an autistic-like mouse and more downward modulated calls in a typical mouse. Okay, so that's kind of standard stuff. But one of my questions is measurement, and this is going to get to, we're going to move into some kind of difficult philosophical issues in a moment, and this kind of starts to get us in that direction. Is measurement of one mouse's approach toward another all that relevant? And the reason I ask that is, consider the approach of my dog versus my cat toward me. Hopefully I can get this to work. This is about 6 hours isolation. It's the greeting that I get from my dog. This is the greeting from the cat. So if you were an autism researcher in the United States today, you would say that the cat is autistic. And that's because we really can't think about the emotions of these animals. Because if you look 5 minutes later, the cat's sitting beside me and the dog's looking out the window for her next social interaction. So perhaps we need to consider more than just what the animal does as essentially almost a robotic organism responding to a stimulus. Maybe we should consider social emotions, something deeper. And to get there, I'm going to kind of walk you through this. In a typical science experiment, you look at stimulus and response. A stimulus is some kind of environmental change. Your response is some kind of behavioral change. But between that stimulus and response, a lot goes on. There's whatever the social dynamics, there's some kind of sensory input. There's a lot of times scientists will go right from neural circuits to behavioral response, but between the neural circuits And the behavioral response is a mental experience. It's feelings, emotions, perceptions, thoughts, memories, these kinds of things we know to be true. As humans, we know this is true. But we can't measure it as scientists. We can measure behavioral proxies, but we can't measure that. And a social interaction, if A is one person and B is another person, we have changes in emotions all the time. And what we have in intervening is just the expression of those emotions through gesture, facial expressions, how we use our voice. For example, that's a shared emotional experience. This is how a lot of what happens in our lives is actually conveyed. And we have to have a motivation to participate in the exchange, which is yet again a layer of emotion. So, I'm not going to say anything for a few seconds. I'm just going to go through some slides here. And I want you all to just look, to introspect, to just listen to your own heart. Listen to whatever, your mind, just listen. You don't even need a face. So what I think is happening is that at your core of of a social experience, you're dealing with an emotional experience. And I would argue that that's a default, a very basic antecedent for how we see our social world. And I would argue that in part because the brain structures that support what you just felt are very, very old. They're in all mammals, and the basic rudimentary forms are in all vertebrates. So perhaps we should consider social emotions in mice. Mice have very similar circuitry, as I said, and a lot of the emotional circuitry actually has, in these blue areas, are areas where they're highly responsive to endogenous opioids, which make you feel good, unless those receptors are not activated, in which case they make you not feel very good, and dopaminergic circuitry that gives you that feeling of expectation for that thing that's going to make you feel good. So what I'm arguing is that as mammals, our fundamental state may be to interpret social interactions in emotional terms, and it's what's invisible to scientific instruments might be quite obvious to us. So this is what I got to go against, because that's kind of pushing it, right? In my field, that's pushing it, to say what I just said, because we've got a long history here that goes back to René Descartes, the father of enlightenment, who says this: I should like you to consider that these functions, including passion, memory, and imagination, follow from the mere arrangement of the machine's organs, every bit as naturally as the movements of a clock or other automaton follow from the arrangement of its counterweights and wheels. That's the way science has traditionally seen what it is to be an animal. And if I have the time, I will make sure to cover where we are now. I think it's different. I think all those elements of social play, whether it's a child or all those different mammalian species, that fundamental feeling of social play is probably very much the same for all of us. But how do we get to, I can just say this, but how can I take it beyond that? A couple of experiments. The first experiment is a pleasurable one. The second one is a little harder, but first experiment. Do mice derive pleasure, and I can say this as a scientist to the scientific community, and they're okay with it. Do mice derive pleasure from a social interaction? Another way to put that, do juvenile mice prefer living with peers over social isolation? So we developed a test where we basically put mice in a social isolation for 24 hours, with peers for 24 hours. And what we do is we put them in two different beddings. And what they do is they learn to associate a particular bedding with a particular social context. And we go back and forth between the two beddings and the two social contexts. And then at some point we test them. When we test them, we give them basically the options of the bedding that's been associated with isolation versus the bedding that's associated with a social interaction. And we ask, where do they go? Because if they really actually value a social interaction, derive pleasure from it, they should spend more time in an environment that's associated with social interaction. The result is actually that for most strains, they show a strong preference for a social interaction, an environment associated with a social interaction, except for one strain, incidentally, an autistic-like strain that seems indifferent to the two environments. And just to go a step further, that same autistic strain, when you condition the environments with access to food versus deprivation of food, seems indifferent. Shows a strong preference for the environment that's associated with access to food. So I want to say also, through other experiments we've done, that we know that social reward, this feeling of deriving pleasure from a social interaction, is not an artifact of domestication. So if we take 13-line ground squirrels, in this case, a squirrel that people would say form colonies because they share a preference for complex habitats that reduce social contact, we actually find that they too, when housed, will always prefer housing with peers, at least as young animals, versus being alone. Wild mammals, even asocial ones, feel pleasure from being with others. And I can say this to the scientific community with a test like that, and it gets published. Empathy. So when we think of empathy, we always think of elephants and dolphins and humans. Until a few years ago, and I became more concerned, especially when people say empathy can only exist in these higher order animals. It seems like religion to me. So the question was, does empathy exist in mice? And what I mean by empathy is Martin Hoffman's definition of generation of an affective state, an emotional state, more appropriate to the situation of another compared to one's own. It's the basis for learning in children, because if I look at an apple, and the child will pick of all the things in the universe to look at, might look at that apple when I say apple. They know, they have an empathic feeling to the attention that I hold to a particular object in the surroundings. And what it's not anything remotely like a compassionate act. The compassionate act may follow an empathic response, but it's not necessary. It's just feeling into the feeling of others. Do mice feel empathy? Now, these experiments are a little rougher, but I think it's an important point, and I think it shows a little bit of the value of neuroscience. So what we do is we house animals in two compartments. In one compartment are animals that are going to get a shock, a light shock, and in another compartment, and that shock is associated with a tone. And in the other environment, there's going to be mice that are watching these mice. And what you see is, so the mouse that gets this shock is going to get a 30-second tone, get a 2-second shock, 90-second silence, repeat. 30-second tone, 2-second shock, 90-second silence, repeat. What happens is that the mouse in this chamber, a mouse starts to, when it hears the tone, starts to freeze in response. Freeze, I think it's a fearful freeze in response to that shock, in anticipation of that shock when it hears the tone. This is not a pleasant experiment. But what I have is these other animals that I watch. And what we see is that, and this isn't pleasant, the animal that gets shocked squeaks. What happens is the animals that are listening orient towards the animals that squeak. And what happens is that the animals that observe actually become, when they get put in that same chamber, just simply hearing the tone, they become fearful of the tone. They actually feel the fear of the animal in the cage that's being shocked, anticipating the tone, as if it is themselves. So we can actually reproduce this without any shock at all, we just play these squeaks after the 30-second tone. And the mice that hear the squeaks become fearful of the tone in anticipation of a shock. And I can go in a lot more detail about this. But that suggests that these animals are fully capable not only of deriving pleasure from being with others, but of feeling, emotionally having an emotional connection with their conspecifics. We also know that mice feel empathy, so we know mice feel empathy, but even the brain regions that are activated in an empathetic response in a mouse are the exact same ones that are experienced in a human being. The same are activated in a human being. So this requires, for me, a change. So I'm a card-carrying scientist, right? I got kids going to college. This is what I do for a living. I've been doing this stuff for 25 years, but when you start to think of what this means, for me, it meant I've shut down my mouse lab as a result of these experiments. That's not easy to do. But I didn't shut them down for the shock experiment. I shut it down for other reasons. This is how these animals are raised. They're raised in shoeboxes. For the first 4 weeks after they're born, all they do is push on the walls, climb on the rack on the top, and burrow through the bedding. After about 4 weeks, it's a thing, I think it's learned helplessness. They just stop moving. They stop moving around. They just sit in those cages. They experience a constant temperature and humidity. Lights on and off. There's no dawn or dusk or anything like that. There's no social refuge. And it's no apartment complex, what they're used to being in. This is another reason I've stopped doing this. This is how mice are raised, like I just said. If you put them in just a slightly enriched cage, not a typical environment, what you find is that the neurons become vastly more articulated. They show a massive amount more breadth in their synapse connections. They're essentially a much brighter, more intelligent mouse. If you take a look at a rat out in the wild versus a rat, or a rat in a house versus a rat that's in a lab, its weight is about 30% heavier. The brain weight is about 30% heavier. And when you think about it, when we look at these much more intelligent animals, maybe intelligent, who knows actually, but these animals that are supposedly more like us, this is standard housing relative to the environment that they typically have. You've got to ask yourself, how much reliable data are we getting as scientists from understanding these animals, from studying these animals? So I want to step back and tell you kind of a little bit like where we're at. So anthropomorphic, which every kid knows you should not be anthropomorphic, described or thought of as having a human form or human attributes is the definition from Webster's. From the Royal Society, when we talk about animal models, here's the definition. Model species are used to test possibilities that would be difficult or impossible to test using the target species. In general, one species may be used as a model for another when, despite other differences between them, the two species strongly resemble each other in particular ways. Sounds like anthropomorphic to me. So we're caught in this difficult spot where we can't be anthropomorphic. We do see animals as machines, yet we're testing them for social functioning that's relevant to understanding things like autism as if they were human. So there's a fundamental problem here. I love Upton St. Clair. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And in part, that's the problem with my own community. Not entirely, but it's a problem actually with the whole world. We do this all the time. It's not just scientists, but it's a difficult issue. So there's a time for change. So what I've done is I'm working I've changed my own research. I'm still collaborating on experiments with mice. But I now work with wild ground squirrels, with sea lions, and with children. So I've made a couple of changes in my own life to deal with this issue. But it's not all rosy there either, and I think this is where you're all going to feel a little worse. So California ground squirrels was the species of my choice because they live here, theoretically, right? Willamette Valley's nearby. We all had some of us had a nice glass of Pinot a few nights ago, probably from the Willamette Valley. And here's what the Willamette Valley looks like. It's got all these beautiful vineyards and stuff. But the California ground squirrel that's supposed to be in this range isn't here. I went to so many places to try. I went to the Oregon State and talked to people in the farming community. They're gone. I mean, I can't find a population to test. This is the reason. So this is, okay, vegans, you're going to be bummed, but this is how we create our vegetables. We need to have, the rodents also like our grain. They really do, because they have to eat too, right? So we have to kill the rodents to get, it's either the rodents get our grain or we get our grain. So what we do throughout the Willamette Valley is we inject rodenticides, which are typically zinc or aluminum phosphide, into the ground that go into the burrows through these tractors. Or we use anticoagulants that kill these animals. It's a very painful death, because we know that from humans that have experienced it. And this is what we have to do to get our vegetables and our grains, unless we go organic. There is always a new low. So farmers still have these problems. In an organic farm, what you do is you put a bucket in the ground, you put this kind of contraption here with some peanut butter on, and the animal jumps on this, falls off, lands in the water, okay? Dies, drowns, right? Or you can shoot them. Actually, shooting them probably seems like the most humane way to kill them. Maybe the most. So now you can have my angst, right? We can all share in this together. I put us here now. So now I've got about 5 slides, and I got to get us out. And I've got 5 minutes to get us out. So hopefully I can slow down. Enjoy the ride. Okay, so with a farm, what I've decided to do is start using, there's an organic farm that's nearby. This is interesting. There's an organic farm. It's a vegetable farm on the other side of the Cascades, where there are more rodents, because I think there's a lot less pesticide use. And this farmer is devastated by rodents. So because he's an organic farmer, he can't use poisons. So what he does is he hires his son to shoot the rodents. Because if he doesn't shoot the rodents, there's no organic seed, there's no food for any of us. He's paid his son $288 this year for killing rodents at 2 cents a head. So that's 14,000 rodents that he killed on his 40-acre land. And what we're working now with, he says he can confound these rodents by planting different grasses, etc., different kinds of vegetables around the plant, different kinds of plants around the plants that he wants to harvest. And they can essentially tangle up the rodents. Well, it turns out they tangle up the rodents that come from the neighbor's yard a lot better than his own. And the difference is that I think the difference is that there's coyotes in the neighbor's yard, and they develop a brain that might be quite different from the brain that's developed in an animal that it doesn't have a lot of anxiety and can maybe have a more creative response to these issues. So there might be a solution to this by just having farmers allow natural predators to come back into the land to clean out some of these high rodent populations. But that's a very different cultural way of looking at things, especially for these communities. I'm working with some people to do a few more lab experiments. One is, and I think I can get this almost always from all the scientists that say that we are so much better than rodents. Only humans are capable of biographical consciousness. If you have a mouse press a lever for how long it's been alone, and it can actually press the appropriate lever at the appropriate time, you can solve the question of whether rodents have autobiographical consciousness. They say that only humans, dolphins, and elephants have self-recognition. Well, we can do that experiment in a ground squirrel. And we can ask whether it wipes a mark that's put on its face that it sees in a mirror, whether it does that, which apparently requires an enormous amount of intelligence, which I don't quite understand why. Here's a few take-home points. One, science needs to adhere to its own tenets. This came out of the New York Times last week. Some hominid along the evolutionary path to humans was probably the first animal with a cognitive ability to understand that it would someday die. To be human and to cope with this knowledge. This is coming from a theoretical neuroscientist. How would he know? But so we got to bring science back into this process. This stuff is all over the place. That somehow humans are in this exalted place. Somehow God touched them at some moment. There's still that underneath. There's a little bit of that. And it's everywhere. It's not always God. It's like it could be like there's a change in the FOXP2 gene sequence that occurred approximately 5 million years ago. I mean, we come up with stuff like that. Take home point 2. The burden of proof should be that on scientists to prove non-human species incapable of thought, emotion, and self-awareness. So I don't have to do experiments like this. We shouldn't have this issue right now. We should assume, given what we know about evolution, given what we know about just spiritual life, that these animals are probably a lot more like us. We are animals, by the way. Then they are different from us. Why is the burden of proof? Why is the parsimony that they're robots and we're not? That doesn't make sense scientifically. Take home point 3. I think we need much. We can't. I don't know if we can completely get rid of neuroscience because I'm in a community of people that are very, very wonderfully concerned about animal well-being. But I could be in an audience full of parents with autistic children. And they need hope, they need help. And to some extent, maybe these experiments can help us, just as farming is never going to stop, just as vegan farming is always going to result in rodents dying. I think there's a possibility that neuroscience is going to stick around, but if it's going to stick around, let's make it good. Let's have much larger cages. Let's use open enclosures. Let's give them life. Let's give them a temporal variation as opposed to just this stagnant, monolithic environment. Let's give them spatial variation. Let's look at wildlife in health research. Let's give them stuff. Let's give them a life. And I think that's a big part of this. Because this is no model for that. That young monkey, that young rhesus macaque is no model for a child in the first place. So this is just silliness. And we know that. And my final point is this. Non-human animals experience, I think that if we agree that non-human animals, even mice, experience abstract thoughts and emotional experiences, directly or indirectly, all human beings, as a requirement of our lives, we kill them and we replace them. And I think we need a new philosophy to deal with it. I don't think we can continue to hold on this philosophy that we're somehow better. I think we have to realize that even if we try like anything not to displace these animals or kill them, we do. And the question is, and I think as we deal with issues of other countries and people where the atrocities are much huger than maybe we think we commit, I think it might help us to try to understand how we can come to terms with this. How we can come to terms with the issue that these rodents are highly sentient, with rich emotional experiences, and we have to compete with them on this earth for food. That's it.
Excellent. We have just a little over 10 minutes for questions. So based on those two very exciting conversations, hopefully we'll have some.
Yeah, hi. your last point that, we're in a situation where we compete with non-human animals for food, and that competition is always invariably stacked in our favour. And you pose a question, we need a new philosophy to deal with it. Can we find one? I wonder whether you considered this in the context of Albert Schweitzer's ethic of reverence for life. Albert Schweitzer posed the same question that you did and came to the same conclusion that in a situation of will to power, will to gain resources at the expense of all these other non-human animals, he had written quite a bit on this ethic of reverence for life. There's been quite a lot of scholarship. I'm wondering whether you come across it.
Not at all. It sounds like something I should be reading.
Sure. Talk to you after.
That would be great. Thank you. So.
Other questions? Yes, right there.
I just had, because rodents and mice are not part of the animal welfare, it's difficult to find out how many of them are actually in the system in these universities, in these research laboratories. Is there a way to find out, or is there anyone keeping track of how many millions of these rodents are in these labs?
Yeah, well, we have to report. No. No, there is a way. There is a way. If you look at I think the veterinarians for the facilities that house them keep tallies because we have to pay for the per diems. We have to pay for each cage per day. So let's say if there's 1,000 cages in my laboratory, I have to pay $1,000 to the veterinarian or the vivarium for their care. So I think you can get it that way. You'd have to go. It's a little bit of a struggle because you'd have to. Most universities have multiple animal care facilities, but like at OHS, you could probably get it just through like the Department of Comparative Medicine, which has that. You are right. There are tons of animals, especially rodents. There's an enormous amount of rodents in the system.
So you're saying actually to ask about how many cages there are versus one per cage?
Oh, well, that's the other, right, and
way
that's still a rough
phrase it?
estimate. You can't get more than 4 per cage because of that's just too many. And IACUC would not approve of that. So you know that it would be a lower estimate. But typically we raise, because investigators don't like to spend money, and 1 animal per cage is pretty, is not good, as you can see from my own experiments. You're probably dealing with 2 to 4, maybe 3 to 4 animals on average per cage.
Do you know our NIH-funded research grants, do they have a more stringent reporting requirement on numbers of rodents?
They do, but it's what we do is we just way overestimate those numbers so that we don't have any. There's not a chance that we're going to get hurt. That we're going to run out of our ability, our access to them. And they don't seem to mind. I mean, they don't care if we use. I put in one of my protocols that I'd use 40,000 rodents, and the reality was I probably used 800. They don't care.
So what you're saying is sort of radical. What kind of repercussions have you faced from other people's women?
The best way I think the Academy has of dealing with me and some of the people before me, like Jaak Panksepp has been one of the great proponents of moving in this direction, or Richard Greenhouse, is just to avoid the attention. It's essentially just to keep moving. So you say, rodents have an empathy, maybe we should do something different. And I say, yeah, we definitely should. And they just keep going on doing their own experiments. There's some kind of, there's some kind of cognitive dissonance. There's some kind of disconnect between the subjective and the objective that occurs in, I think, the scientific community that we don't really understand or deal with.
You seem to tolerate what you're doing. There's been no actual repercussions for yourself for this?
No, because, I haven't come out and said, look, we should stop testing. Actually, I just did, but the paper hasn't been published yet. So ask me in 6 months and I'll know a lot more.
My question is for Moe. You mentioned that there isn't a strong domestic tradition of animal activism in Japan. wondering what your take is on the prospect for international pressure, perhaps akin to what's happened with the Japanese whaling situation over the years.
Well, there are strong international like external pressure in Japan, and actually the Animal Welfare Act in Japan started because of the external pressure. So even now, even in the whaling issue, Japan is experiencing the pressure. However, there's some people who are saying, yeah, it's really strong culture, although it's not really a culture. Like some people are having those habits, but not like those culture of eating whales, but only in the coast side. So it's not like Japanese culture, but yeah, it's really yeah. Difficult issue.
So I'm actually taking a question. I'm going to take your credit from another student. Recently, I went with an animal law fundamentals class. We went to the Primate Research Center, and he asked the scientists, I'm curious what you have to say is, I guess what bothers you about how animal activists approach animal research, and what you wish you knew. Like, what advice would you give us for approaching, getting that dialogue going without turning a scientist off?
This is a tough one. I feel like there's the conversation even among scientists is stilted, to say the least. I know some scientists have brought up the idea of just testing animal behavior, mouse behavior in bigger cages because it's more humane and you get more relevant data. And he was scolded by a senior person in my department for giving essentially food, fodder, whatever, to PETA in those kinds of organizations. I almost think you have to work outside of science. I think you have to work around scientists. I think you'll find people like me in the community. There's others. But you have to get them at that moment when they're not petrified of losing dollars so that they can't feed themselves. And I think that's just very, very hard to know who those people are.
Have you ever heard of the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine?
I have.
I guess they're kind of that same direction. I think people like you are very helpful to us because you do understand it so much more than we do.
And Millie, I'm wondering in a similar sort of way, you've spoken about different shifting cultural attitudes in Japan towards testing, towards other animal issues. And in reference to, I'm afraid the gentleman left, but in reference to his question, you talked about sort of a concern about cultural pressures being seen as coming from outside. How do you see animal activists or those who advocate for the interests of animals in Japan being able to make progress without being seen as incorporating an external cultural approach?
Well, actually, I think the Japanese activists are having challenges, facing challenges, and there are only few rights activists and many welfare activists. So, like as we saw, the act is not really protecting animals. So, yeah, it's really tough. Yeah.
So it sounds like the future, at least for the moment, is in welfare in Japan.
Yes.
We probably have time for maybe 2 more questions, maybe 3 before Voodoo Donuts. If anyone has them. I thought donuts might get you interested, yes.
I don't even like donuts.
I bet everyone, because it's good.
My question is, in general, how do you feel universities are dealing with organizations like Physicians for Responsible Medicine in terms of the impact that they're having? Do you feel like the animal research in universities is waning, growing, doing the same? Do you have any sense of that?
I sense that probably with the decreased funding, things have gotten worse. what we've come up with is good ways to get around things. So I've, like, the IACOOK that governs my own work will ask questions about, like, well, if you're saying you're going to use 10,000 animals, 10,000 divided by 3 years is not going to give you 3 numbers that are the same. Two are going to end in 3, and one's going to end in 4. And they want to know when that 3,334th animal is going to be used. That's kind of the level of concern that they have. I think questions like, I've never seen an IACOOK throw out an experiment because it's just a dumb experiment. And I could talk to you about some experiments that have been done that are just, everybody in this room could understand that they're not going to work, and yet they're quite well funded. I think this happens, but we're all, we're colleagues. We all work together. And so there is no kind of control in that sense. The other thing is that I think, especially with monkeys and primates, but even with, it's a big issue. We talk about environmental enrichment, but we talk about it relative to putting an animal in a cage with nothing else in it. And so rather than thinking about it in terms of what its ecological experience might be, an experience in the wild, we talk about it in this one particular way. So environmental enrichment, people will actually somehow think, I think, that it's compassionate to put a TV at the end of a room with a bunch of primates. And even if you don't get stations because it's just static, because there's so many layers of cement wall between those primates and the outside world, that's condoned because it's enrichment. So I think that we've even come up with a language. We've come up with so many ways in which we can essentially justify what we do without any real evaluation. And these committees then just serve mostly as rubber stamps. They always put us through hoops. We always complain about the hoops, but they're really not substantive hoops. They're essentially just things to do in my book, most of the time.
So we have reached the end of our allotted time. So our next events will be in the LRC, where within you will find the vegan voodoo donuts, part of your critical Portland experience. But before you leave, please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you very much.